Good morning. Buenos dias. Thank you to all who have joined us today for this webinar. Education in Puerto Rico needs systemic change. And as many of you know, the island of Puerto Rico has endured a lot in the past few years, starting with hurricanes Irma and Maria in September of 2017, then multiple earthquakes in the beginning of 2020, and currently, as in the rest of the world, we're battling an ongoing pandemic. As you can imagine, all of this has significantly impacted and shaped the education system on the island. However, Puerto Rico was recently given a singular chance, an opportunity to reconstruct and revitalize schools impacted by the devastating 2017 hurricanes. And we have to make sure we get it right because we owe this to the children of Puerto Rico. Since 2017, a child starting first grade in certain areas of Puerto Rico will have missed almost a full year of classroom education as a result of the hurricanes, earthquakes, and the pandemic. That year represents more than just a year of learning. The schools have been damaged over and over again, but the real loss is not in the capital stock, but in our human capital. In September 2020, the federal government announced that the Puerto Rico Department of Education, PRDE, would receive $2.2 billion in FEMA funding as a result of the widespread destruction caused by the hurricanes. Now, these funds, if distributed equally across 850 schools, would represent just under $3 million per school, which is within the realm of construction costs, not a great deal. Realistically, though, when put into perspective, these billions in funding could be consumed with simply a light touch of fixing and monitoring, maintaining a few things in each of the school buildings. So instead of looking at it as dividing this money equally across 850 schools, we believe we should consider what changes will have the biggest ripple effect on the trajectory of students and families. We can begin by considering ways that PRDE can strategically invest these $2.2 billion to improve schools throughout the island, respond to the changing demographics on the island, and address the demand for new skills and approaches to education that are necessary at this moment in education and beyond. We want to make the best possible use of these $2.2 billion in FEMA funding to assure Puerto Rico's children and families will be prepared to enter the globally competitive world and succeed. Any effort to restructure and revitalize Puerto Rico public schools must be approached in a thoughtful manner and allow the Puerto Rico Department of Education to leverage the experiences, both good and bad, of others and put these funds to work in a way that will have exponential impact. A focused and strategic approach on PRDE schools has the potential to impact every single one of its 276,000 students in classrooms across the island. Our hope today is that this webinar will provide a vision for PRDE and the general public with information and insight on previous success stories and lessons learned from other cost-effective school reconstruction and revitalization efforts. Our desire is that PRDE and the government of Puerto Rico are successful in the disbursement and investment of these funds, and that this in turn significantly and positively impacts students, improving their success in this ever more competitive world. I want to in advance thank all our panelists today for joining us and sharing their experiences. I also want to thank all participants listening to this webinar and assure you that our singular intent is to begin a dialogue that the government can continue as it makes its plans on the effective use of these funds. I will now turn it over to our moderator, Karen Maldonado, the Oversight Board's Education Reform Director. Karen?
Thank you, Natalie. Good morning, and thank you all for being a part of our webinar on restructuring and revitalizing after a disaster, a vision for Puerto Rico's public school. Now, as you know, there are lots of changes happening here on the island and quite frankly, all over the world. But one thing is constant here in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico's public school students are in need of safe, sound, and solid schools. Buildings that are ready to accept students for teaching and learning in the year of 2021 and decades beyond. Which brings us to today's webinar. So here are a few things I'd like for you to keep in mind. The session will be recorded and available in the next couple of days on our website, FOMB's website. There will be simultaneous translation for those who are interested in listening to the webinar in Spanish. And there's a button on the bottom of the screen that will allow you to listen to it in Spanish if you choose to. We'll have 2 panels, and we would love to hear from you after each panel's presentation. So please type your questions in the chat box, and we'll take questions after each panel. And towards the closing of the webinar, we'll tend to more questions as well. If there are additional questions and or comments, please feel free to email our communications team at communications@promesa.gov. The email address will also be available in the chat. So let's jump in. So here are takeaways we're hoping to provide to you today. 1, you'll learn about best practices that can help Puerto Rico's Department of Education, also referred to as PRDE, utilize funds strategically and rebuild schools in a cost-effective and sustainable way. You'll hear how a school district experienced effective rollout of FEMA funds and its impact on school communities. And lastly, you'll have an opportunity to explore ideas on how to restructure and revitalize after a disaster, with the hopes of providing a vision for restructuring and revitalizing Puerto Rico's public schools. Today's panel will consist of 2 parts. The first panel will focus on funding received by PRDE, as Natalie mentioned, potential uses and timelines for these funds, and the importance of creating a facilities master plan to focus on a short-term and a long-term vision that prioritizes staff, communities, and mostly our students. The second panel will focus on best practices of effective school construction and how to build cost-effective schools with high sustainability and success stories on reconstructing and revitalizing schools post-disaster. So for the first panel, we'll have Margarita Mosquera, who is the Director of Infrastructure and Community Services sectors for Puerto, also known as Central Recovery and Reconstruction Office for Puerto Rico. Margarita will provide background on the amount of FEMA funding that PRDE will receive, how PRDE can use these funds, and considerations for Puerto Rico's Education Department to keep in mind while developing a master plan to utilize these funds. Panelist Bradley Nichols, who is partner at Ernst & Young and focuses on complex assurance and federal disaster grants claims as a member of the Assurance and Federal Claims Services team. Bradley will talk to us about the importance of developing a facility plan, and how PRDE should adhere to the guidelines of the plan and create a short-term, but also a long-term vision while utilizing the recovery funds. And lastly, on our first panel, we'll hear from Richard Garanza, who is the New York City's Department of Education's current school chancellor. But in 2017, he served as the superintendent of Houston's Independent School District during Hurricane Harvey. Richard will share lessons learned while leading a school district during a time of disaster, the vision needed to resuscitate and revitalize schools after a natural disaster, and the necessary tools to galvanize the community and rebuild schools for effective teaching and learning. So I'm going to pause there and dive directly into the first panel. Margarita, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Karen. Just like she stated, I am currently working at the Core 3 office. I am the infrastructure director for the community services sectors, which include the sector for education, health and social services, natural and cultural resources, and I forgot the fourth one. I'll come back to you right now. I want to thank everybody for being here today and for giving us the opportunity to have this discussion today, where we'll focus, as you stated, on education. To me, it has been a humbling experience to be part of this effort. I believe that we have a lot of work to do, and it is only possible if we all work together with all the agencies and collaborations. There's a lot of efforts going on at the same time, and we need to align efforts in order to stay focused in the bigger picture, which, like the director just stated, it's the benefit of Puerto Rico's education system and our children. So with that, I am going to jump right into the first topic on the agenda, which is to provide some background on the amount of FEMA funding that PRD has received and will be receiving. I'm going to go back a little bit into the history of how we got here. Originally, as almost everybody involved in the recovery at this point knows, most of the efforts have been focused in the emergency work. We received approximately 17 million for Category A work and approximately 259 million for Category B work. There has been about 99% of Category A work already dispersed, and efforts for Category B are still ongoing. That is, the current disbursement is around 18 million for this area. The reason for this is because most of the work is still being done. And as for those who are not aware, FEMA is a reimbursement program. So the work has to be done in order for any subrecipient to submit receipts or proof of the work in order for the funding to be dispersed. With that in mind, that's the background for emergency work. I'm going to talk a little bit about the latest obligation, which is everybody's concern and hope for everything that is to come. Yes, PRD received the third biggest obligation in history. It is 2.29 billion. We'll round that up for 2.3. For the reconstruction or revitalizing of the whole school system. 1,109 schools were taken into account when establishing, or facilities, I should say, when establishing or assessing this estimates. And I'll go a little bit into the methodology of how we got here in a couple of slides forward. But as we stated, the obligation was finally 2.3, and it was made official on September 24th this year. Some of you may ask why it took so long to get to this obligation. There was an initial approach on having one fixed cost estimate when we started working with the recovery. However, because of the lack of data at that point, it was very difficult to come up with some type of methodology or cost estimation that made sense. So this effort at this stage of the recovery in 2020 was possible due to all the information that had been gathered the first couple of years. The schools were inspected right away. However, it was a very general inspection because other things came in the picture at that point. Thanks to the BBA, Bipartisan Budget Act, schools were considered critical facilities, are considered critical facilities. Therefore, we understood that we have the ability to rebuild a lot better and not just to fix existing damages. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but in a nutshell, that's the essence of the BBA. So due to that, we went in and we have worked collaboratively with FEMA and PRD in order to assess all those damages and gathered all that data necessary to establish what would become the methodology for this estimating approach. Part of the effort now, as we stated, this obligation also has a cost share, which the state or subrecipient and/or are responsible for. We are working on determining where we're going to get that funding, and we are also working in conjunction with several agencies to be able to make sure that there is enough money provided to get the ball rolling and kickstart the efforts. because like I said, we do have the obligation. However, there is some cash flow that needs to be on the table so that we can start working and then later on reimburse this money. So part of the FAST, or this obligation, which I'll go into it in, like I said, in a couple of points forwards. Part of the requirement, or the first requirement that this obligation has, is a compromise to work on a work plan. This work plan is due, the preliminary first version of the work plan is due on December 22nd. The work plan will be updated every 90 days. It is not expected to be final yet. It is a live document and it is ongoing. We will be working together with PRDE and also AEP, Edificios Públicos. We also own some of the schools and all the agencies that need to collaborate in order to work this work plan. This work plan needs to be submitted to FEMA. Like I said, it's our requirement. They will neither approve it or deny it. It's more of a understanding how progress is being made and what the next steps are. However, we understand that this work plan is also essential for our day-to-day operations. So we're trying to work out this work plan as detailed as possible so that it will serve as a framework for the effort, which, as we know, will last 5 to 10 years easily. So we want to make sure that we have clear direction on this path. With this obligation, and as part of FEMA PA policies and procedure, we have, or PRD will have, a management cost, which is calculated on 5% of the amount obligated. At this point, if it's approximately $114 million, which will be available for management. Currently, we have obligated 16 of those for $114 million to start planning and working out the work plan and the administrative and recovery office that needs to be built by the subrecipient in order to be able to manage and carry out this work plan. I'm going to go a little bit into the methodology of the FAST. The FAST is the FEMA Accelerated Award Strategy, which was the strategy used to get to that $2.3 billion obligation. Because of such a massive effort and so many facilities, considering that there is approximately around 6,000 facilities calculated or counted DI damage inventories, which is what we call it, for the Department of Education. There was, with FEMA, we set out to establish what this accelerated award strategy could be, and in order to reach that agreement in a faster way, rather than the traditional national workflow, which we know has multiple steps, and it has taken us very long to get projects through the channel. So with that effort, and this was an effort that was done not only for PRD, but also for Department for Prepa and PRASA for Puerto Rico, but we'll stick to the Department of Education in this panel. So the first phase for the FAST strategy was identifying the population of buildings and then establishing what the sample would look like. This was done in conjunction with a separate team from FEMA. They called them the CAF team and the Tiger teams. We worked daily with them, and this has been an effort for about 8 months with a lot of excellent resources that have made this a very important task and prioritizes every day in order for us to be able to move forward the recovery. And in that team, I have to mention, there was FEMA people, there was Core 3 people, there was PRD people. It was really a joint effort, and we're very proud of how the collaboration happened in that area. The second phase was identifying the data that we needed from that sample that was already identified. The data, we needed to collect the DDDs, which were the damages, descriptions, and dimensions for the sample. We also needed to establish what the possible methods of repairs were. incorporate the survey, which stated that BBA would be applied for each one of these facilities. And amongst others, we also had to take into consideration the applicability of lead and asbestos costs based on the age of where the buildings were constructed, and establish a formula to apply that, as we don't really have that kind of information to that specific level at this point. Part 3 or phase 3 of the project was estimating, coming up with a standard cost estimating format, which FEMA had, but we had to adjust for this particular efforts in order to make sure that it served the purpose for schools specifically. In this section, we also contemplated future price factors to make sure we accounted for escalation as we move forward throughout the process, so we know it will last several years. So, and then a statistical analysis was made in order to extrapolate all the costs based on the damages identified, and then extrapolate them based on square footages per all the schools. In a nutshell, that was the process. It's a lot simpler said now that we understand it, but a lot of it was being developed while we encounter certain situations. Several other factors that are important to mention were taken into consideration, like, for example, buildings that were from historic preservation, schools that are located in Vieques and Culebra, which are further, and they involve certain other logistics costs, which wind factors were incorporated, understanding that the sample needed.
I'm just
Yes.
gonna pause you right there, because there's probably tons of examples that you can give, right? And we want to make sure that the other panelists are able to jump in as well. So
Okay.
I'm hoping that when we have questions, you'll be able to jump in again. So thank you for that. BJ, you're up.
All right, great. Thank you, guys. Pleasure to be with you today. I'm going to talk just a little bit, and I think Margarita did a great job overviewing all of the funding and kind of the process. So I'm going to move through that part of this rather quickly. But again, just to ground everybody on a couple of key facts with this, as Margarita says, we've got close to 2.3 billion after an insurance reduction of 2.2, and we don't want to lose sight of that. Insurance funding in the grand scheme of things, resulting in about 2 billion of federal share at 90%, and over 200 million of what will ultimately become a local share that also has to be dealt with. And on the bottom, we just kind of put it in context. Again, Margarita kind of went over this, but in FEMA terms, we're talking here about Category E, the permanent restoration of the facilities. And again, it's a very unique, kind of application of not only the 428 CAP grant, but also the the BBA funding that was referenced. If we can go to the next slide. So this is a chart I kind of call the waterfall, and it's a little bit small, but let me kind of walk you through it. And again, I think it's important to understand kind of what the different areas of funding can be used to do. So in the first column is the insurance settlement, and insurance, and in particular we're talking about commercial insurance. It has to be considered before any of the other federal funding comes into play. From there, and that can be used probably some of the more flexible funding, in that when you settle a commercial insurance claim, basically you're signing off on a proof of loss, and in this case at least, and you're pretty much done. There aren't the same kind of back end audit and documentation requirements that ultimately come into play. So again, coming back to our other thing, we have FEMA Cat A funding that came into play for debris removal, Cat B for emergency protective measures, and then we're really talking about, again, this Cat E funding that's going to provide not only for the permanent restoration of facilities, but then also you see included in that CAP grant is 406 mitigation, or the ability to build back stronger than you were before. as well as an ability to build back to industry standards that the BBA hits on, here in a minute. From there, you're also going to hear another buzzword potentially about 404 mitigation. This is or HMGP funding. This is a different bucket of mitigation funding from FEMA that goes to the Commonwealth and is in the Commonwealth's control to decide how to utilize that in conjunction with FEMA. And then also there is HUD CDBGDR funding, which can be used to provide that local match. It's rather unique, one of the only funding streams on the federal side that can be used to provide the match for another grant. And then, as well as not losing sight of the USDE Restart grant that was really intended to help jumpstart education in the system following the storms, and has really picked up a lot of speed in terms of spending and impact. But nevertheless, one of the concepts across all these sources of funding is avoiding a duplication of benefits. So things can only be paid for once, and that has to be exclusive across each one of them. They can't be paying for the same thing. I'm going to go to the next slide. Oops. Okay. Let's just go back to that one. Yeah, I think it's just summarized on there. So in terms of the, just wanted to touch real briefly on the key aspects of the 428 CAP grant. So this was something that came out of the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act, and the idea here is that you give an applicant a fixed bucket of money with which to administer, their recovery project. From the federal side, it reduces, or the hope was, the intended or the goal stated was to reduce the administrative costs of executing on the program, to provide flexibility, including the use of any excess funds above the execution of the project for other approved uses. It was intended to expedite assistance and provide, financial incentives on all sides, to execute projects in a timely manner and in a cost-effective manner, right? To manage the costs on both sides. The downside of all of that is that you have to complete the project, and you will not receive any more funding, to execute on that project. So when we go into some of the other aspects, on time and on budget is a very important aspect of executing on these programs. In terms of the BBA that's come up, the Bipartisan Budget Act, this was a very specific element of the legislation that provided some flexibility to both Puerto Rico and the VI, really to build back and basically ignore any deferred maintenance or the condition of the facility before the storms came, which is a frequent kind of item of discussion with FEMA in terms of rebuilding. They're really looking to rebuild, to the state of what you had before, the pre-disaster design function and capacity. It allows you to build back to prevailing industry standards, and not only the assets that were damaged, but also if there are other areas of the system that need to be worked on to achieve those industry standards, it allows for the funding to be used there as well. So again, you've got a tremendous amount of flexibility when it comes to the arrangements of the funding. I think Margarita really hit on, this was a very unique and innovative way in which the grant, the CAP grant was formulated, which is great, and I think really expedited what could have been a very long process. From a process standpoint, the first step is that initial work plan. So the agreement says that within 90 days of the project obligation, the subrecipient, which is PRDE, has to provide to FEMA and the Commonwealth this work plan for the submission of the proposed scope of work and any hazard mitigation, that goes along with that. So that's not the actual scopes of work. It's really just a work plan to say, how are you going to get that done? And from there, it requires quarterly updates, and then of course gets into the actual submission of the specific building scopes of work that the department wants to exercise. And I think one key from a compliance standpoint is that really does have to be completed before any construction can be done. FEMA has environmental and historic preservation requirements, and other requirements that have to be met before any work is done, or it does jeopardize the potential funding. And the other thing is that it comes with an initial 5-year period of performance, meaning that the work is supposed to be done in 5 years. Those are frequently extended, but any extension would have to be justified and explained to the federal grantors. So keeping an eye on that is also important. And the last point, so to kind of summarize and really get to the meat of it, in looking at the risks and opportunities. So when you think about the flexibility that I already talked about, I'm on the opportunity side of the balance sheet here. There is a lot of possibilities to reimagine and right size, not only PRDE structure, through a strategic planning process. There's a lot of flexibility that's built in the funding. There is a recognition of the state of affairs with regards to the assets, where they were before the storm, and the flexibility to build them back without, endangering the funding. There's also an ability to not only build back what was there, but also, to flex that, make it fit with the educational needs of the Commonwealth, but also to build in, stronger facilities and a significant amount of hazard mitigation to make sure that when another storm does come, that the facilities withstand that and that they're able to get back up much more quickly. On the risk side of things, I think based on kind of this overview of the fact pattern, it's pretty easy to see with kind of the short headlines, and that 5 years will go quickly, that an ability to make timely strategic decisions is going to be key. Where does the department want to be? What do they want the education system to look like? Where are those schools located? What are their sizes? What does the kind of educational experience look like within them? Those things are all on the table, but with looming timeframes, those decisions have to get moving rather quickly. Establishing the goals, objectives, and planning assumptions for the 90-day work plan. Again, there could be extensions requested related to that, but I think the idea that needing to get going on what this plan is, understanding where vendors are going to fit in, procurements that have to be undertaken in order to make progress on that are all very key things. And also thinking about how all those vendors fit together, who will be doing what, how do you divide up, the strategic planning from architecture and engineering, from potential construction, and the strategies that go into executing on those, avoiding conflicts of interest. Those types of things are all very important. Once you hit the actual phase where you have people on board, we're talking about submitting hundreds of individual scopes of work for buildings, building designs, hazard mitigation on all of those. It's a tremendous amount of work. As I mentioned before, navigating a procurement process, kind of multiple times with multiple vendors. And the outcome of that is, of course, having to provide oversight and supervision over not only so many projects, but, multiple contractors in executing those projects. And I think, even in the best of cases with, very well-funded and capacity-rich organizations, that kind of task and undertaking is daunting. And I think when the other thing to keep an eye on, again, coming back to is that budget performance is going to be critical. There isn't more money coming. The CAP grant makes it very clear that this is the funding that will be available in order to execute that project. And if the project isn't executed within that, it still has to be completed or it endangers the remainder of the funding. Along with that, there's also just the regular compliance issues that come along with any FEMA funding, procurement and contracting, environmental historical preservation, and of course, the audit and financial accountability side all of which can lead to audit findings from both FEMA, but also the Office of Inspector General. So, with great opportunities also comes, significant risks that also just need to be paid attention to. So that wraps it up for me. Thank you.
Thank you, BJ. We'll now turn it over to Richard Garanza.
Thank you, Karen. I think, and buenos dias to everyone on the call. I think Margarita and Bradley really summed up a lot of those real operational, detail-oriented issues that are associated with rebuilding after natural disasters. I'm gonna speak more towards the perspective of a system leader and what you should be thinking about as you go forward in terms of rebuilding. I can't emphasize enough how important it is in terms of your portfolio, the hazard mitigation that Bradley talked about. And what I think is really incredible is that you're able to rebuild and mitigate for some of those hazards with this funding. We didn't have that ability in Houston after Hurricane Harvey. So that's really, really good news. And I would say that's an opportunity that shouldn't be overlooked. But what I would say is who do you serve? You serve the community, you serve the children of Puerto Rico. So it should be very, very noted that as you're doing this kind of rebuilding, you are also dealing with a community that has been severely traumatized multiple times by multiple events. So one of the biggest, I would say, goalposts in order to address some of that trauma is to rebuild so that the community, the children, the adults who serve the children have somewhere they go that feels like what it used to be in terms of normal. And that always is a school. And if you're able to rebuild the school with improvements and mitigating the hazards that would make that school vulnerable during any subsequent events, then what you're going to be doing is really investing in the emotional well-being of the community as well as the infrastructure of the community as well. Lessons that I learned with Hurricane Harvey was number one, trying to do this work without really understanding and keeping at the forefront the trauma that the community has undergone, then will create later on when Bradley was talking about strategic planning process. Well, you need people to be part of the strategic planning process. So if you're not approaching the planning process with an eye towards what is the new normal going to look like. So that means taking into account the technology, taking into account the accessibility. Perhaps you had a facility in an area that wasn't ideal for that facility. Now you have an opportunity to change where that facility is to better meet the needs of the community. Keeping that in mind as you go forward is going to not only engender tremendous support from the community, but it will also rebuild that sense of community and trust if that's an issue, but definitely address the issues of trauma. We found that in Houston, after rebuilding, we lost, we had a portfolio of a little over 700 buildings in Houston at the time of Hurricane Harvey. We completely lost 12 of those buildings, completely flooded out, walls could collapse, horrible. So the ability to rebuild 12 buildings was an incredible opportunity. Yes, it was a tragedy, but as we spoke to the community, we spoke to the community about it in terms of an opportunity to rebuild and to make better what we had. I would also emphasize that time is of the essence. All of the work plans, all of the individual work plans, the management of the projects, all of that notwithstanding and being very, very important, the immediate galvanization of the community, the immediate organization into work streams, the immediate strategy of having a strategic planning process has to happen concomitantly with the planning process for the building of the buildings as well. The third thing that I would say that it was critically important in terms of lessons learned for us in Houston as we were coming out of Hurricane Harvey was to structure our internal processes for, I'm not a technical guy on the construction side, but I would say your record keeping, your bills, what are you buying, what are you purchasing, structuring that internally to mimic what you're going to have to report for FEMA purposes, federal purposes, grant purposes as well. So what we did is we instituted a process actually through a painful process, because some of the things that we were claiming were not reimbursable. But after a couple of times of getting hit that way, we instituted a process by where it was literally, figuratively speaking, a screen that we put under everything that we were looking at, everything we were purchasing, everything we were considering. And that screen was very much, will this be reimbursable? If it is, great. We've already done that work. If it's not, then we know where we need to try to find the additional funding, other funding streams, local tax levy, et cetera, to be able, or insurance, refundable insurance claims, to be able to build and claim those expenses as well. So again, it was from a system leader perspective, it's getting the community on board so that you're able to move quickly. From a fiduciary responsibility perspective, it's about making sure that your systems are aligned so that your reporting processes are in line. And then third, from a vision perspective, how are you rebuilding and building something that's better and will be able to, I love the term hazard mitigation. How are you going to mitigate for the next hurricane that comes, or the next natural disaster that comes? How are you going to build your building better and more robust so that you're able to withstand and move through the next disaster?
Thank you, Richard. We're going to open it now to questions. I have 2 questions here in the chat, but I've also would love to hear from the panelists around lessons learned. So Richard, he brushed upon this, but I want you to think about what are some of the lessons that you wish you would have known in advance, and it had some unintended consequences as a result of not having that information prior to engaging with FEMA funding?
Yeah, so I'll take a stab at that. I think I mentioned aligning our financial systems and our claiming systems so that what we were doing, we were actually kind of checking 2 boxes at the same time. Immediately post Hurricane Harvey, obviously we were dealing with destruction, we were dealing with flooding, we were dealing with loss of life. So there was a here and now that we were immediately immersed in. But I wish, having the retrospective perspective, I wish that I would have known how important it would have been to align our systems to be able to keep track of those expenses. So as we're saving lives, as we're building temporary locations for students and for staff, as we're moving entire schools from one campus that has been utterly destroyed to another physical location, being able to account for all of those expenses would have made it a lot easier for us to account for them later on. So that's one important piece of information that I think you already have a head start on going into this project. But for us, that would have been a real benefit and saved us a lot of heartache and resources, quite frankly.
Thank you. So I'm going to take a question from the audience, and the question is as follows. Funds you stated were approved for 1,109 schools. Currently, many schools have been closed by the government. What will happen to the funding approved for those schools? Will they also be fixed and reopened, or will the funding be lost?
Hi, so I'll take that question. So the 428 provides the ability for us to restructure all the facilities or to strategize about how we want to go about this funding and address those schools. All of them need to be addressed. However, if there is no need for them to keep functioning as schools, a plan needs to be incorporated, or they need to be addressed in terms of keeping it safe for the public. Alternate projects could be submitted for these facilities, and their functions could change, but the budget doesn't necessarily go specifically to each school. We have the ability as we work on the plan to determine how we want to use this funding to maximize the schools and the facilities that we want to improve.
Thank you. I have another question here that says, how will the negotiated indirect cost rate agreement of a given agency of 25% be allocated across the cap and the matching requirements? CJ?
I can talk a little bit. Yeah, I can talk a little bit about it. There's some specifics that I'm not sure we can get into just because I don't have the background. But any indirect, any expense incurred has to come under the cap. The cap is the cap. It is the feature of the 428 cap grant agreement that doesn't change from implementation. So anything that's incurred, if it's hazard mitigation, if it's an approved indirect cost rate that's applied to the grant funding, if it is, increased cost of constructions, if it's just budget overruns, it will have to come in under that cap. And the local match requirements will be the local match requirements, the 90-10 split, with 10% ending up with the local government, whether that comes back through the CDBG-DR program or is covered by local funds, but those things won't change regardless of the dollars or the types of expenses that are allowed inside the grant.
Okay, and then lastly, you'd mentioned creating the 90-day plan, the first iteration of the plan with a vision. If you think about some of the plans that you've seen in the past, what are some of the missteps that people have made? And how can PRDE avoid these missteps?
Yeah, so the thing I would start with, just to double down on what Richard was saying, so managing these kinds of grants and helping people across the country is what I do full time. And the biggest messes that I walk into are those where those things that Richard listed off of kind of aren't at the forefront when things kick off. Everybody hates paperwork. It's annoying. It's detail oriented. It's difficult to track. Systems aren't set up right. Questions have to be asked, but paperwork and documentation, unfortunately, are literally the lifeblood of the FEMA program. Failure to comply with those things are the biggest hang up that you can find. It all starts on the procurement side, having a well-documented procurement, RFPs, scoring, awards, being able to have the documentation to tell the story of how an award was made, why a vendor was chosen, what it was that they were done, following that through to them executing on it, having the documentation to be able to, demonstrate at the level of detail that FEMA and others are looking for that the work was completed, and that all the documentation comes together is just, I just can't underline that enough. And I know there's a lot of focus on that already, but I think that's the first thing. In terms of the plan, I think, and I think based on the comments that Margarita has made, I think there's I think that all the parties are working together, which I think is the key thing, right? So like I said, I don't doubt that there can be some extensions to that, but the need to get going on what that plan is, who are the parties that need to be involved, and making those strategic decisions early, I think, as the other panelists have hit on, I think is really the key. The sooner that conversation can get started with things like this today, the sooner those can get baked into the plan, and then you're executing, on those priorities. And, I think waiting and pushing that out, while, that may need to be what happens, but, with that 5-year window, you'll start to really eat into that. And of course, there are extensions available to that as well, but you really do have to be able to, justify all of those. So that's kind of my thought.
I want to expand a little bit on this. Thank you for that. I agree with almost everything you said. We are currently working on the plan. There is a framework already established. There was a lot of data already being gathered and put together. I think one of the most important things that we need to consider from mistakes perhaps made in the past is that we need to integrate our communities to be part of this plan. It is important to deal with the people, just as we stated before, but understand what the needs are and understand the geography of our schools. We do have small schools in very remote areas, which are very difficult for some of our population to access other areas. So perhaps we can work on those routes if those schools are not needed in those areas. So there's a lot of data that has already been gathered. So as soon as we have on board who's going to determine what this plan, what the final plan is going to be, we're in a good position to make those decisions. I think some of these decisions, or all of these decisions, need to be data driven. Therefore, it'll be easier to explain to the community how we prioritize or what items were prioritized when finalizing this plan. We already went through this consolidation program, process a couple of years ago. So with that in mind, we did gather most of that information. With the new flood maps and a couple of other items, we need to revisit some of those areas because those facilities may not be the best ones right now. So in terms of the plan, we have a lot already structured. Just the final determinations need to be made. Of course, we have a change in probably administration and government right now. So, but we are ready for the new team that comes in to start making those decisions within the first 2 to 3 months. So we should be in good position for that.
Thank you so much, Margarita. Thank you, BJ, and thank you, Richard. We're going to close out the first section of our panel and jump into the second panel. You're welcome to stay on. We actually would appreciate that just in case there are other questions that come up. But let's dive into our second panel now. We'd like to welcome 3 guests. We have Lorraine Grillo, who is the current CEO of the New York City School Construction Authority. Lorraine's team was responsible for the reopening of more than 70 schools damaged by Hurricane Sandy in record time. She'll be sharing lessons learned post-natural disaster while managing negotiations for FEMA reimbursement. Then we have Dara Duragi, who is the Vice President of Architecture and Engineering at Project Frog. Dara will share effective ways on how to restore and revitalize school buildings and educational facilities in a manner that is cost-effective and disaster-ready. And lastly, we have Jimari Bao. She is the lead architect at 21st Century Schools Project. She'll provide insight on successes and challenges faced while leading the 21st Century Schools Project with Quality Zone Academy bonds. At this point, I will turn it over to Lorraine, and she will let us and lead us into the second panel. Thank you, Lorraine.
Thank you so much, Karen. It's such a pleasure for me to be here today. Yes, we've been there, done that. So it's kind of a pleasure to be able to share some of our experiences. But as I've listened over time to the other panelists, I think that you guys have taken a very good step in the right direction. I also think that having E&Y work with you is a great asset because they did work with us during this period of time. Just going to list for you a couple of the things that I think are the most important as we move forward. The SCA, or School Construction Authority, really had a bit of a leg up on what you folks are going through right now in 2 ways. First of all, we do a yearly building condition assessment. So we know the condition pre-natural disaster and post-natural disaster, and we can really dive into that information and get that information very, very quickly. The second thing that we do on a regular basis is demographic projections. So as someone one of the panelists was talking about, you have to look as we go forward with the limited funds that you have to look at where the need is the greatest. And the possibility of making some changes and eliminating some buildings certainly has to be taken into consideration. The second area that I think is very, very important is that relationship with FEMA. We had an extremely good relationship with FEMA after meeting with them several times and understanding exactly what they needed and exactly what we needed to do. And I will tell you, and it was said earlier by the Chancellor, by Richard, information, data, paperwork, all of that stuff is very, very important. We created at School Construction Authority a tracking system that it allows us to put all of this information into a database so that if there's ever a question, an issue, we can pull that information right up, and we have it for FEMA or if there's an audit or any of those things. So really happy with that. And I think I've mentioned it earlier. We're happy to share that information with you folks as you move forward. I think there's a couple of other things that I think was really, really important. I think independent estimates are critical as you move forward. And one of the reasons for that is, and I'll give you an example. As many of you must know, construction is not an exact science, and very often changes occur throughout a property. So if someone underestimates a particular agenda item, and then we come back to the actual construction, and we find that that item is, several times more expensive than we anticipated, there's a lot of work that will go into convincing FEMA to approve that particular item. So I think it's really, really critical on a larger scale to get independent estimates. At the SCA in New York, we have in-house people, but I'm not sure that you folks do as well. If you don't, having an independent entity is a great idea. I think the other thing that came up, which I thought was critical, and Richard brought that up, has to do with communication. Communication to teachers, communication to administrators, parents, and the local community is critical. They have to be partners. We have to work together to get this work done effectively. Again, in New York, we are a very close-knit community, I will say, in that any construction that happens within New York City is felt by the local community. The noise, the time, all of those other things, the disruption to their lives. So it's critical to have the community buy into this plan. Richard said it has to be, it has to provide some normalcy for the local community, and that can be done with a constant communication with these folks. Other than that, I mean, I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have about this and our experiences with it. So thanks.
Thank you, Lorraine. Tara, we can move on to you. Thank
All right,
you.
great. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. So my name is Dara. I'm with Project Frog. I'm going to give you a little bit of background of where I come from, the state of California. So California is no stranger to natural disasters, with earthquakes and wildfires being the most common in our state. Actually, this presentation is about 90 minutes. So by the end of this presentation, California will go through 27 small earthquakes. Oh, sorry, 270 small earthquakes, one every 3 minutes. And in the past, 5 years, I'm sure you've seen it on the news, we've had about 42,000 fires affecting about 8.8 million acres of our state, which is a lot. Can we go to the next slide, please? Puerto Rico, similar to California, is located at called intersection of nature. It's the convergence of the North American and Caribbean tectonic plates, and as mentioned, unfortunately, end of 2019 and beginning of 2020, Puerto Rico was hit by a swarm of earthquakes, and in 2017 was hugely affected by Hurricane Maria. So going back to the state of California, we have legislations, codes, and mandates in place to safeguard public safety and well-being in case of natural disasters. Going back as far as 1933, the Field Act in California that banned the construction of unreinforced masonry and mandated for earthquake forces to be a part of the structural design process, and also established the Division of State Architects in California that is responsible for reviewing and approving plans and designs for all California public, K through 12 schools and community colleges. And also when it comes to wildfire, we have codes and mandates in place, especially the California Building Code regarding proper construction and fire-urban interface. Go to the next slide, please. So designing and building public schools in California is a very complex and long procedure with multiple stakeholders involved in the decision-making process throughout each project. This diagram is a very high-level diagram, sort of showing how the process might work for a public school here in California. You have a big team of architects, engineers, you have the school district, the school, community, city, even state involved. And of course, in the construction, you have the contractor and subcontractor. And under that, they're all under the oversight of the Division of State Architects and other authorities having jurisdiction. Go to the next slide, please. So just a quick stat. The size of a K through 12 infrastructure in the United States is about 2 million acres of land. That's about the same size of island of Puerto Rico, the main island of Puerto Rico, which is about 2.25 million acres. And currently in the US, about 300,000 portable classrooms there are. In the state of California, we have about 900,000 portable classrooms, 30% of the total classroom infrastructure. And unfortunately, portable classrooms become a temporary way to provide classroom space in California. And some of them are about 40 years old. Aging portables are poor learning environments due to below average metrics associated with indoor light, air, and sound, and they're quite unsightly. So how do we approach that? We are innovators in the AEC, and we've delivered over 600,000 square feet of education buildings over the past 14 years. We have a system-based approach towards our design, and we design in a kiloparts/componentized platform system, and we focus on sustainability and optimal learning through natural air, light, and sound. And these are cost-effective solutions that can offer protection from seasonal and market-driven volatility, higher quality through off-site fabrication, and faster and easier on-site component installation. So it is imperative to approach and plan large-scale recovery projects after natural disasters properly to avoid pitfalls and achieve long-term success. Because poor planning and bad decisions can lead to unachievable schedules, which can take decades to accomplish. Substandard temporary infrastructures can become permanent, and massive cost overruns can also increase cost. And low-cost bidders, for instance, can really impact the cost of a project. Can we go to the next slide, please? And the next one. So a well-orchestrated program can dramatically impact schedule, control cost, and also enable us to mitigate risk. A typical Project Frog building, these stats are associated with about 10,000 square foot building. It can be 50% faster to open. We minimize the truck traffic to the job site, which can be ideal for dense urban areas, for instance. All right, can we go to the next slide? And we also take a systematic approach towards building platforms and optimize structural system design through analysis, which will enable us to address majority of continental US with one structural system. That's very important. We enable flexibility, automation, and usability in our process. It's an end-to-end process. And we do actually, by using different parts and pieces of technology, we do enable tracking within our system. And we have this manufacturing/product lens towards our buildings to be able to enable scalability. Next slide, please. And speaking of flexibility, the way Project Frog operates, in terms of different delivery methods, we have had a lot of experience working on design-build projects throughout the state of California. We've also have had a lot of experience working on lease-back projects, partnering with contractors and school districts working on their projects. and also can do design, build projects across the state or across the country. So our overall goal is to provide a cost-effective, high-quality, and well-designed classroom buildings for everyone. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much. Jimari, we'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Karen. Good morning, everyone. I was really excited and happy to participate in this discussion here to offer my experience with Schools for the 21st Century program. I think it's important that while we're at the cusp of having this really large influx of money, to help in school improvements by FEMA, it's important to understand what programs have come before, large programs of this sort, to maintain some institutional knowledge and continuity of prior efforts. So this, I know we're short on time, so I'll try to get through this really quickly. This is a really large program that I want to try to summarize here in like 5 to 6 minutes for you guys. So first of all, the Schools for the 21st Century program started back in 2010. It was funded by qualified school construction bonds from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, ARRA, and the funds totaled $748 million for school improvements. The program totaled 81 schools impacted. 6 of them were new construction, impacted about 40,000 students across the island. The program was run through a joint effort between the public-private partnerships, AFI, the Puerto Rico Financing Authority, and the Department of Education, with program partners from Public Buildings Authority and DOMEP, who are really the school building facility owners in the island. The program started with a master plan that was commissioned for a firm called Fielding Nair International. They're leaders in master planning for schools. And the whole approach was more of a holistic approach in modernizing schools. It was both infrastructure to support this new educational modality, as well as training and education to those teachers and those education professionals that were going to be in charge of this new learning modality. The Fielding Nair team conducted a very detailed school assessment for all of the public schools on the island. They used and maintain a GIS data bank for all of that information. And they also conducted building condition indexes and educational adequacy assessments that would both come up with a scoring methodology to then recommend which schools were the ideal schools for this modernization. Based on that process, 87 schools were originally selected for modernization. They were spread out across the island. There were all sorts of different schools, elementary, middle school, high school, vocational settings. The public-private authority commissioned and engaged local firms to prepare the necessary surveys for each of these targeted schools. And we also established an organizational structure to manage the implementation of this very large-scale school program. That's where AFI came in, and that's where I really participated in the program. It is no surprise that one of the biggest issues that were found with schools had to do with maintenance of the facilities. And that's why we chose to go with a design, build, maintain modality. And that's how the projects were organized and implemented on the field. The first thing AFI did was run an RFQ process to pre-qualify design build consortiums. Based on that, they were qualified in varying levels of capacity through their bonding capacity that was presented. After that, we published design build conserve RFP packages. Some of the smaller schools were combined into one package. The larger schools, we had about 6 that were new construction, were published individually, and those schools were actually also required to be LEED certified. The packages included baseline as-built drawings as well as recommendation from schematic designers that were contracted by APP. And we published basic design guidelines that would outline the 21st century concepts for each of the architectural firms to take into consideration and to implement in their designs. So we were trying to take advantage of the professional, of all of the local architects, professional experience, their creativity, in the implementation of these very definite school concepts that we set forth. We also drafted some very detailed school design standards that included all of the concepts for the 21st century schools. I think the next slide has some of those summarized. If you could go to the next one. So the first thing we did was assess the infrastructure of the actual school facility. Biggest concerns were structural retrofits. We did have to deal with a short column issue that exists in public schools here. That was an unknown factor when we started planning for these, so that was a big change order for the program to be able to attend to this issue that was coming out of the field. The electrical capacity was also a concern, especially as the schools for the 21st century supported IT, Wi-Fi integration, and this whole technical aspect of the new learning environment. The schools for the 21st century provided full Wi-Fi in all of the school campuses to be able to support the new modality. We also found issues with waterproofing of roofs, was probably one of the worst things that affected the school infrastructure, as well as stormwater management. After that, we incorporated all of these 21st century components that had to do with creating community spaces, allowing for students to have exterior views, allowing for students and teachers to collaborate, to work outdoors, to have security within the school buildings without having to have all of these jail-like environments, if you want to call it that, with all of these security bars that we have in schools. It promoted sustainability. It incorporated science and art into the teaching environment. And it also provided for new ergonomic furniture and a new color palette to further support creativity in the students' learning. If we can move to the next slide. So I'll jump straight into lessons learned in this very abridged presentation. Lesson number 1 for us was constant stakeholder coordination and communication. We had read at the very onset of this program a change order due to lack of alignment between the schools for the 21st century concepts and the Department of Education's requirements for spaces. So we had to go back to the drawing board with the planning, the Secretary of Planning and the Department of Education. And we held workshops with each of the areas, education. We came up with the new space planning requirements, and those were implemented soon after. Lesson number 2, start with well-defined program concepts and requirements. Good specifications ensure consistency in the quality of the facilities for the end user. Lesson number 3, in-depth analysis of existing conditions. The structural component of schools is very important, obviously, with taking into account all the recent earthquakes and the short column issue that we have in a lot of them still. Facilities maintenance and conservation should be taken into account. Some of these schools fail because their roofs are leaking and no one's going up there to clean out the gutters. As simple as that. The next point, and I agree 100% with what Margarita said earlier today, decisions on schools need to be based on hard data collected, and those decisions need to be apolitical. That is an important point in being able to reach as many school facilities as we can with this new assignment. And the last lessons learned, we had, while we achieved in record time the construction and modernization of 81 schools, some of the most important trainings that were to be offered to the teachers did not take place. Some of the spaces that we built in supporting a modality were never instituted in the end. So a lot of communication with stakeholders is, I think, the most important part of this whole program. And with that, I'll leave it for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamadi. Thank you, Dara. And thank you, Lorraine. I'm going to open it now to some questions that we received in the chat. The first one, Jamadi, I'll actually address it to you. It says, in the 21st Century Schools project, how is community engagement pursued and culture integrated?
During the planning phases, there were workshops that were conducted in communities across the island. We also, while we developed the schematic designs for each of the school facilities, we went out to each of the municipios and we presented the schools for the 21st century concepts, as well as the concepts for their particular school, and took into account what, the comments that we received from the community.
Okay, thank you for that. And then the other questions are open to all the panelists, so please chime in when you feel it's appropriate. The next question is around the FEMA plan. So when and where can the plan be accessed? And they're interested in how do you track the changes in that live document?
So,
Margarita.
hi, I'll take that question. So as I stated before, the plan it's in the works. We have established a timeline and a time frame from the for the items that need to be incorporated. It'll be the Department of Education's responsibility to share this information, as they are the sub-recipient responsible for leading this effort. Of course, Core 3 will support them in every way, and we will work together to make sure that that everything is in place for FEMA funding eligibility. At this point, I cannot tell you exactly when it will be published, but I know that, like I said, one of the pillars for this frame is community integration, and we will try to engage the community as much as possible.
Lorraine?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that information has to be shared, because at least from my vantage point, I get the impression that there's going to be some major changes. And that information has to be out there. Obviously, in the design and construction industry, it's really important that folks who want to become involved get a real clear picture of what the Department of Education is looking at, what sustainability methods they need to use, that sort of thing. So I think the quicker you can start to get that information out and get public input, the better.
And speaking about public input, right, here's another question around best practices in community engagement. So thinking about an education project of this humongous scope, other than agencies on the island, what other engagement as a community can we expect or should we expect to see? So let me take my teacher hat out and ask it differently.
Yeah.
So in the best case scenario, when you think about the community, a call to action, if you will, for the community, what's the best case scenario? What can the community do to really get behind this effort?
You know, if you don't mind, Karen, I'm gonna weigh in a little bit, only based on my own experience, because excuse me, community outreach was how my career in this business started. So I think most importantly, obviously, you have to deal with parents. I mean, parents of kids that are in these buildings need to be included. Now, I don't know what the structure is in Puerto Rico. I know that we have here in New York, you have parent-teacher organizations within each school. I think that that kind of outreach has to happen. We have particularly school districts within the city of New York. They have groups of leadership that you have to engage. I mean, I think it's multi-pronged. I think it has to be for everyone. And then when you also, again, we have community boards here in New York. They are not related to the schools, but they are community activists. Those are the folks that you have to get on the train.
Thank you. Thank you, Lorraine. And then the last question here I'll ask is around, it's a very technical. So will this project include sustainable infrastructure practices like collecting rainwater, sustainable energy, energy sources, things of that nature? Margarita?
So, hi. Yes,
Hi.
I was unmuting. So at this point, I mean, it is, I don't see why we would not integrate sustainability into it. Part of the hazard mitigation efforts will be will be essential to build better and more resilient, as we keep reminding ourselves the importance of this. So do we have a concept design? We have some conceptual ideas that need to be narrowed down, and PRD, once again, will have to establish what's a priority for them, and to make sure that, as the Bradley will stated earlier, it is a cap grant. So all decisions will actually impact the financial budget. We do feel like we have a pretty, and we have already a couple of budget analysis started, a substantial amount. But at the same time, we need to ensure that the projects are completed. So we need to make sure that we don't get too creative on that side, and we can complete the master plan for each one of the schools in need. But however, prevention, sustainability at this age in time, and after everything that we have encountered and we have lived with, all the disasters that we have suffered in the past couple of years, we have certainly learned the importance of having sustainability. We have also engaged in multiple donations for solar panels, particularly for the schools, so that the schools, primarily the shelter ones, could be ready and open to serve the community as a whole within these disasters. So the answer to that is definitely yes. We just need to make sure that we stay within a reasonable budget to complete the work in a responsible way.
Thank you.
If I can chime in and offer my 2 cents with that.
Yeah.
21st Century included a lot of sustainable concepts in their schools. It's important to keep in mind the maintenance that's involved with some of these sustainable systems, because, you know, in the question, the question asks about energy and renewable energy, and we know, you know, that requires a certain amount of maintenance. Same with rainwater harvesting. So I would keep that in mind when, you know, those plans are put together.
Okay, and our last question here is around state education agencies. So the question is, how did other SEAs address the non-brick and mortar strategy to engage the human infrastructure in school communities? Not just in the planning process, but in the implementation of the program to develop capacity so that schools and regions can be supported in this process. And just to give you a little bit more in the question, what entity could actually support the Department of Education in developing and implementing this strategy?
I'll take the first shot at that, and then
Thank you, Richard.
Anybody wants to add as well. I think what's really important, as I had mentioned in my comments, that you have to take a trauma-informed approach to not only the rebuilding and the construction, but also the engagement of the community. So what that does, you know, obviously we as a Department of Education are responsible for the children and those that serve our children, but it's also incumbent upon all other government agencies, from the medical perspective, the social service perspective, to really have an integrated approach to rebuilding the community, more than just brick and mortar, but also from that trauma-informed perspective. So what we did in Houston, and quite frankly, what we're doing right now in New York City, given the pandemic and given the trauma that's imposed on our communities, is very tightly interweave social-emotional learning strategies and approaches with the academic approaches. And by doing that, we've been investing in training our teachers and training our principals on how to not only use these strategies, but to really weave them into their instructional approaches. Now, the reason that's important is that we know that as students are able to re-engage with the learning process, we know that there's no replacement for a well-trained, caring teacher in front of a student. But recognizing that teachers also need, I would say, a toolbox full of these strategies that they can then very, very explicitly know how to weave into their instructional planning, how they can, for example, one of the first things that our teachers did when we came back to in-person learning, it's in September 21st, was instead of doing an assessment and trying to find out where are my students in terms of the academic standards, which is important to know, the first thing they did for that first week was engage students in a conversation about, so how are you feeling? And what have you seen? And how have you learned to do different things in different ways? And then they were able to write about it in multiple languages. Again, they're writing, they're speaking, the teacher is assessing their fluency, but at the same time, students are working through their emotions through this very traumatic time period that they've gone through. That's just one of many, many examples of how it's important to weave those kinds of strategies into the academic planning, but to engage other agencies, other departments, if you will, in the government to help in a coordinated way with that approach.
Any other thoughts? Okay. Well, we have come to a close, and before we close out for today, I definitely want to thank the panelists, thank the audience, thank you for your questions. We know that the Department of Education of Puerto Rico wants the best education possible for its students. We hope today's webinar has provided insight for the community, for those that are invested and are willing to invest in the Department of Education and its students, on how to begin a solid process to restructuring its schools. However, we hope that, and we know that hope is not a strategy. And therefore, we want to ask you to please engage and contribute to the recommendations and strategies to revitalizing schools in Puerto Rico. Thank you so much. Have an amazing day.